Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum. So you'll often hear people accuse libertarians of being an echo chamber, but the reality is that we do often criticize each other's arguments as well as arguments from non-libertarians. So in this video I'm going to be responding to an article that was actually written by a libertarian. The article I'm responding to today comes from a website called libertarianism.org. The article is called 6 Reasons Libertarians Should Reject the Non-Aggression Principle, and it's written by a guy named Matt Zwolinski, so let's get into it. So first I want to address the premise of this article, the idea that libertarians should reject the non-aggression principle. The problem with that is that the non-aggression principle is kind of the core belief system of libertarianism. Believing in the non-aggression principle is what makes someone a libertarian. Saying that libertarians should reject the non-aggression principle is kind of like saying Christians should reject the Bible. Now maybe there is an argument that the non-aggression principle should be reinterpreted, reevaluated, maybe some adjustments made to it, but that doesn't seem to be the premise of this article. He doesn't seem to be arguing that the non-aggression principle should be revised or improved, but jettisoned altogether. And right from the onset, we can see some of the problems of this article as soon as we get to the tagline. Quote, "A stringent application of the non-aggression principle has morally unacceptable implications," end quote. So right off the bat, we can see that this article is primarily criticizing a point of view that libertarians, or at least most of them, don't actually hold. Most libertarians don't advocate for a super stringent application of the non-aggression principle. They believe that it should be the norm or the status quo, absent some exigent circumstance. If someone were to, say, use somebody else's property without their permission or initiate force on an innocent person for the sole purpose of avoiding immediate injury or death, I don't think even the most staunch libertarians would fault them for it. Quote, "Many libertarians believe that the whole of their political philosophy can be summed up in a single simple principle. This principle, the non-aggression principle, or non-aggression axiom, hereafter NAP, holds that aggression against the person or property of others is always wrong where aggression is narrowly defined in terms of the use or threat of physical violence." End quote. So we can see that this person is attacking not only a strawman version of libertarianism, but also a strawman version of the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle does not limit its definition of aggression to physical violence. The non-aggression principle posits that people, by virtue of being sentient, self-aware entities, are entitled to certain rights, and that those rights should not be violated. It doesn't matter whether or not physical force was used or not. If you violated someone's rights, that's against the non-aggression principle. Quote, "From this principle, many libertarians believe the rest of libertarianism can be deduced as a matter of mere logic. What is the proper libertarian stance on minimum wage laws? Aggression, and therefore wrong. What about anti-discrimination laws? Aggression." End quote. So anytime you ever talk about the minimum wage or anti-discrimination laws, the problem with both of these involves what's called free association. The simplest way to explain what that is the idea that two consenting individuals have the right to associate on whatever basis they agree to, so long as they're not violating anybody's rights in the process. Now, freedoms exist in both the positive and negative sense. What that means is that the freedom of something means not only the freedom to engage in that something, but also the freedom not to. So for example, with freedom of speech, that includes not only the right to say whatever is on your mind, but also the right to keep your silence. So when we look at minimum wage and anti-discrimination laws, what we see is that these are both violations of free association, but each of them violate it in different ways. Minimum wage laws violate your right to free association in the positive sense. It puts restrictions on who you can associate with, or more specifically, the terms on which you can associate with them, while anti-discrimination laws violate your freedom to association in a negative sense. That is, they force you to associate with someone you don't want to against your will. So both of these do violate the same fundamental right, they just do it in different ways, if that makes sense. Next, this person tries claiming that libertarians are against public roads and public schools. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it depends on what you mean by public. If by public you mean open to the public or free for the public to benefit from, I'm not necessarily against that. I mean, there are examples of things like that are funded in a way that's voluntary. However, oftentimes when people claim that a service should be provided publicly, what they're basically saying is that people should be forced to pay for it against their will. People should be robbed at gunpoint to pay for it. That's a different story. Quote, "The libertarian armed with the NAP has little need for the close study of history, sociology, or empirical economics. With a little logic and a lot of faith in his basic axiom of morality, virtually any political problem can be neatly solved from the armchair." End quote. So this has to be like the go-to anti-libertarian talking point. It's just a theory, bruh. Sure, the non-aggression principle may sound good on paper, but it's simply not practical to implement in reality. What this argument basically does is look at the theoretical side of libertarianism and portrays that as if it's like the be-all end-all of our arguments. Libertarians do make empirical as well as theoretical arguments. You're just choosing to cherry-pick the theoretical arguments. We have historical examples of big government causing a lot of problems, as well as the free market fixing a lot of problems, a lot of which people credit government for actually fixing. We point to articles and research done by the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, and instead of people giving this data a fair evaluation, they hand-wave it away as a bunch of propaganda put out by libertarian think tanks. So it's not that libertarians don't make empirical arguments, it's that whenever we do, they're never given a fair shake. Quote, "On its face, the NAP's prohibition of aggression falls nicely in line with common sense. After all, who doesn't think it's wrong to steal someone else's property, or to club some innocent person over the head, or to force others to labor for one's own private benefit? And if it's wrong for us to do these things as individuals, why would it be any less wrong for us to do it as a group, as a club, gang, or a state?" End quote. So this argument primarily boils down to logical consistency. As Immanuel Kant, a famous German philosopher who I feel is horribly underrated in libertarian circles, put it, an ideal theory of ethics should be universalizable. That is, an ideal theory of ethics should be equally applicable across the board. If it's wrong for me to do something, it should be wrong for everyone else to do it as well. Now, the reason this poses a problem for government is that people often perceive in government the special right to do things the rest of us don't have. They can demand money from your paycheck without your consent. They can impose rules on property they don't own. They can prohibit victimless actions and initiate violence against people on that basis. These are all things that none of the rest of us can do. Now, the reason this is a problem is because of something called the consistency principle. Since all contradictions are a priori false, it must be the case that in order for an argument to be true, it has to be consistent, avoid contradicting itself. A lot of people claim that the government should have special rights that the rest of us don't have. The problem is that the government is made up of the same Homo sapiens as the rest of us. What makes them different that they should have these special powers? Or where do they come from if the rest of us don't have them? This is why universalizability is very important when formulating an ethical principle, because it avoids problems of consistency like this. Quote, "But the NAP's plausibility is superficial. It is, of course, common sense to think that aggression is a bad thing, but it is far from common sense to think that its badness is absolute, such that the wrongness of aggression always trumps any other possible consideration of justice or political morality. There is a vast difference between a strong but defeasible presumption against the justice of aggression and an absolute universal prohibition. As Brian Kaplan had said, if you can't think of counterexamples to the latter, you're not trying hard enough. But I'm here to help." End quote. So notice how in that paragraph he basically defeats his own argument. He correctly points out that there is a huge difference between a prohibition of something and a presumption against something, but he still tries to argue that the non-aggression principle is an absolute prohibition on the initiation of force rather than simply a presumption against it. If you're coming out and acknowledging that the two are different, then why do you still equivocate them? So everything we just went through before, that was all sort of preliminary introductory stuff. At this point in the article, we started getting into his actual reasons that he lists off, and this is the first one. Quote, "Number 1, prohibits all pollution. As I noted in my last post, Rothbard himself recognized that industrial pollution violates the NAP and must therefore be prohibited. But Rothbard did not draw the full implications of his principle. Not just industrial pollution, but personal pollution produced by driving, burning wood in one's fireplace, smoking, etc., runs afoul of the NAP. The NAP implies that all of these activities must be prohibited no matter how beneficial they may be in other respects, and no matter how essential they are to daily life in the modern industrialized world. And this is deeply implausible." End quote. Well, first of all, as Shane Killian points out in his response to this article, the NAP does not prima facie prohibit all pollution. It simply says that in order to pollute a piece of property, you have to either own that property or have permission from the person who does. This is essentially the idea behind a landfill. Somebody somewhere owns a big-ass piece of property and they're like, "I'll allow you to pollute this in return for a fee." Same thing with sewers. I know that the way it currently works, most sewers are government-run and tax-funded, but if we had a more more libertarian type system, we would have people, building and maintaining sewers and basically saying, hey, I've built this infrastructure specifically designed to manage pollution. In return for a fee, I'll let you use it. Now, of course, the author's concern here isn't entirely meritless. In a lot of cases, it's simply not practical to get permission from everyone whose property you're polluting. For example, imagine every time you got in your car, you had to get permission from all the property owners you passed in your car, because there's a good chance your exhaust fumes would be passing through their property. Just to go anywhere would be a total pain in the ass. So I guess the easiest way to get around this would be to establish some sort of a threshold. So under this amount, the pollution isn't considered that much of a problem such that you need permission from the surrounding property owners. And what that threshold would be specifically would really depend on the pollution and what type of harm it's causing. So Mr. Zwolinski here uses the example of burning wood in your fireplace. The smoke that comes out of that fireplace may very well cross over your neighbor's property. However, by the time it does, it would probably be in such a low concentration that they could probably barely even tell it's there. So to summarize it, the way that the non-aggression principle will deal with pollution is basically this. For the practicality's sake, we would establish a certain threshold, and under that threshold it's not really considered a problem. Once you cross that threshold, that is, once your pollution starts causing provable harm, then at that point you would need to either own the property that you're polluting or have permission from whomever does. The next reason that we should supposedly reject the non-aggression principle is that it prohibits small harms for large benefits. Quote, "The NAP prohibits all pollution because its prohibition on aggression is absolute. No amount of aggression, no matter how small, is morally permissible, and no amount of offsetting benefits can change this fact. But suppose, to borrow a thought from Hume, that I could prevent the destruction of the whole world by lightly scratching your finger. Or, to take a perhaps more plausible example, suppose that by imposing a very, very small tax on billionaires, I could provide life-saving vaccination for tens of thousands of desperately poor children. Even if we grant that taxation is aggression, and that aggression is generally wrong, is it really so obvious that the relatively minor aggression involved in these examples is wrong, given the tremendous benefit it produces?" End quote. So kind of like with the last example regarding pollution, this issue largely comes down to a matter of consent. Most people are willing to make small sacrifices for larger benefits. Billions of dollars are given to charity every year. So if someone was concerned about providing vaccinations to poor children, well, there's a number of things they could do. They could donate some of their own money, they could convince these billionaires to donate their money, they could even start a business and use the profit from that. It's not like forcibly taking people's money by the threat of violence is your only option in this situation. However, for the sake of argument, let's just assume it. In fact, let's roll with Hume's example about scratching the finger to prevent the apocalypse. Let's assume it. This guy's still operating on the perceived notion that the non-aggression principle is an all-out prohibition on the use of force. The non-aggression principle does not prohibit the use of force. All it says is that if you're going to use force, you have to justify it. To put it another way, the use of force is presumed wrong, and the burden to justify the use of force is on the person using it. A common example of this is self-defense. If someone's breaking into your house or trying to hurt you and you use force against them to protect yourself, you're arguing that the situation necessitated it, and therefore it would be deemed justified. Now suppose you're in a situation where you're diagnosed with some terminal illness, and if you don't get treated right away, or within some really quick period of time, then you will die. So there's no time for you to wait to save up the money to pay for your medication, and you don't really have insurance because you can't afford it. This person would be justified to, say, break into their neighbor's house and steal the money to pay for the medication, because in this situation it was the only possible way to prevent their death. So just to clarify, the non-aggression principle is not a total across-the-board prohibition on the use of force. It simply just says if you're going to use force, you have to justify it. So the next reason he gives that libertarians should supposedly reject the non-aggression principle is a quote-unquote all-or-nothing attitude toward risk. As Mr. Zwolinski explains, quote, "The NAP clearly implies that it's wrong for me to shoot you in the head. But to borrow an example from David Friedman, what if I merely run the risk of shooting you by putting one bullet in a 6-shoot revolver, spinning the cylinder, aiming at your head, and squeezing the trigger? What if it is not 1 bullet, but 5? Of course, almost everything we do imposes some risk of harm on innocent persons. We run this risk when we drive on the highway. What if we suffer a heart attack or become distracted? Or when we fly airplanes over populated areas? Most of us think that some of these risks are justifiable, while others are not, and that the difference between them has something to do with the size and likelihood of the risk harm, the importance of the risk activity, and the availability and costs of less risky activities. But considerations like these carry zero weight in the NAP's absolute prohibition on aggression. That principle seems compatible with only 2 possible rules. Either all risks are permissible because they are not really aggression until they actually result in the harm, or none are, because they are. And neither of these seem sensible, end quote. So first of all, notice how he's appealing to what seems sensible in order to make his argument. He says that neither of these options seems sensible, but doesn't provide any additional logic or explanation as to why that's the case. This should not strike anyone as convincing. But more to the point, he does correctly point out that since almost everything we do on a daily basis imposes some sort of risk on the people, a total across-the-board prohibition on risk wouldn't be feasible, but he doesn't seem to want to accept the conclusion that you would draw from this, that risky behavior should then only become immoral once it actually causes harm. He argues that this one seems sensible but never provides an explanation as to why. If an outright ban on risks is not feasible to implement, this would seem like the only other possibility. And just as with the previous examples of pollution and initiating force, the non-aggression principle doesn't prohibit risk outright. All it does is put the responsibility if something goes wrong onto the person doing it. So suppose that you take a risk and something bad happens as a result of it, then you're responsible for that and you have to accept whatever consequences come with it. Could mean paying out damages, things like that. So what this essentially does is make people carefully consider the risks that they're taking before they take them. They have to weigh the potential benefits of the risk versus the potential harm that could happen if it goes wrong. Now the author is correct insofar as the non-aggression principle isn't concerned with the specific thought process that people use when they evaluate these risks and make these judgments. That's not what the non-aggression principle is concerned about. The non-aggression principle simply says that you are responsible for the risks that you take. The thought process that you use to determine if the risk is worth taking is on the individual involved. And it's not that the fact that a lot of the things we do on a day-to-day basis impose a risk on the people is some kind of new concept that people just figured out. We have liability insurance and arbitration and all these different things that people have come up with to deal with the very problem that Mr. Zwolinski is pointing out in this article. So risk management, or dealing with risk, is a commodity, is something that there's a demand for that the market can provide. You know, you'd think an article written by a libertarian would at least hint at this possibility. Reason number 4, no prohibition on fraud. Quote, libertarians usually say that violence may legitimately be used to prevent either force or fraud, but according to the NAP, the only legitimate use of force is to prevent or punish the initiatory use of physical violence by others, and fraud is not physical violence. If I tell you that the painting you want to buy is a genuine Renoir and it's not, I have not physically aggressed against you, but if you buy it, find out it's fake, and then send the police or your protective agency over to my house to get your money back, then you are aggressing against me. So not only does a prohibition on fraud not follow from the NAP, it's not even compatible with it, since the use of force to prohibit fraud itself constitutes the initiation of physical violence, end quote. So this argument is basically operating on the assumption that the non-aggression principle only prohibits physical forms of aggression. And as I've pointed out earlier in this video, the non-aggression principle extends to any instance of a person's rights being violated, whether or not that was done using physical force. There are non-physical ways to interfere with people's rights. In this case, the right that's being violated is free association, which I did mention earlier in the video as well. If you recall, I said that freedom of association includes the right of any two consenting individuals to voluntarily interact on any basis that they agree to. In order for this agreement to be considered legitimate, there has to be mutual consent from both parties involved. And in order for someone to consent to something, they have to have agreed to it of their own free volition. That means they have to fully understand the terms of the agreement and on that basis agree to it. So anytime you subvert somebody's free autonomous will to get something from them, you're essentially taking advantage of them. You're using them as a mere means, to use Kantian terminology. So whether I point a gun at your head and say give me $200 or else, or if I say sell you a cancer pill for $200 that ended up being a Tic Tac, well, in both instances I subverted your will. You are involved in the agreement for a reason other than your own volition, therefore I took advantage of you. So either scenario, I gained $200 from you by subverting your will. So either scenario involved the same violation of your fundamental rights, albeit one used force and one didn't. And since this is an aggression, it is a subversion of your rights. It's the type of situation where one can be considered justified in using force. Because remember, as I mentioned earlier, the non-aggression principle does not outright prohibit the use of force. It just says that if you are going to use force, the burden is on you to justify it, and this very clearly, as I've established, is a situation where that's justified. They could send someone to your house to try and retrieve the money. The amount of force they use has to be reasonable. They can't just bust in your door and start beating the shit out of you, but a provable subversion of rights has occurred, and they would be well within their right to use force to rectify that. Also, this argument kind of presupposes that situations like this have to be dealt with using force. Maybe there's some dispute resolution organization that you're a member of, or that they're a member of, that you can handle the situation peacefully. For all you know, maybe it wasn't even an act of volition. Maybe the person honestly thought that was a genuine painting when they sold it to you. So just because a situation can be dealt with using force doesn't necessarily mean it has to be. Alright, reason number 5. Parasitic on a theory of property. Quote, even if the NAP is correct, it cannot serve as a fundamental principle of libertarian ethics because its meaning and normative force are entirely parasitic on an underlying theory of property. Suppose A is walking across an empty field when B jumps out of the bushes and clubs A on the head. It certainly looks like B is aggressing against A in this case, but on a libertarian view, whether this is so depends entirely on the relevant property rights, specifically who owns the field. If it's B's field and A was crossing without B's consent, then A was the one who was actually aggressing against B. Thus, aggression on the libertarian view doesn't really mean physical violence at all. It means violation of property rights. But if this is true, then the NAP's focus on aggression and violence is at best superfluous and at worst misleading. It is the enforcement of property rights, not the prohibition of aggression, that is fundamental to libertarianism. End quote. Okay, well, first of all, property rights aren't some kind of carte blanche to do whatever the fuck you want to people just because they're on your property. Like, if someone starts trespassing on your property, you can't just start beating them over the head. The force used has to be reasonable given the circumstances. So if someone was trespassing on your property, you'd have to confront them, politely ask them to leave. If they refuse, maybe ask again a bit more sternly. If they continue to refuse, maybe use a small amount of force. Because as I've mentioned previously, under the non-aggression principle, if you plan to use force, the burden is on you to justify it. And if the force you used was in excess of what would be considered reasonable, then you're going to have a much more difficult time making that justification. And second of all, this kind of contradicts his previous point. His previous point, that the non-aggression principle doesn't prohibit fraud, hinges upon the premise that the non-aggression principle only prohibits physical forms of aggression. Now, on this point, he is admitting that the non-aggression principle prohibits other forms besides physical aggression. So yeah, reasons 4 and 5 contradict each other. And finally, notice how he tries to portray the enforcement of property rights and the prohibition on aggression as different when they're actually not. Because your property comes about as a result of your self-ownership, you're tied to your property. The non-aggression principle enforces property rights because of, rather than in spite of, its prohibition on aggression. So he's basically taking two things that are the same and treating them as if they're different. So the final reason he gives that libertarians should reject the non-aggression principle is the good old-fashioned authoritarian go-to tug at the heartstrings. What about the children? Quote, it's one thing to say that aggression against others is wrong, it's quite another to say that it's the only thing that's wrong, or the only wrong that is properly subject to prevention or rectification by force. But taken to its consistent extreme, as Murray Rothbard took it, the NAP implies that there is nothing wrong with allowing your 3-year-old son to starve to death, so long as you do not forcibly prevent him from obtaining food on his own. Or at least it implies that it would be wrong for others to, say, trespass on your property in order to give the child you're deliberately starving a piece of bread. This, I think, is a fairly devastating reductio of the view that positive duties may never be coercively enforced. That is what Rothbard himself, who presented this reductio, without apparently realizing the absurdity in which he had walked, rather boggles the mind. End quote. So right off the bat, I'm noticing a pattern. This guy seems to be rejecting the non-aggression principle based on the conclusions that it draws, rather than actually attacking the logic of the principle itself. This is basically the same mistake that religious people make when they criticize evolution or the Big Bang Theory. They look at the conclusion, see that it doesn't line up with what they believe, and reject the principle, believing that the error must be with the principle and not with their belief. And this, of course, leads them to the idea that under the non-aggression principle, that positive obligations can never be enforced. But as I've pointed out earlier when discussing the scenario with the painting, somebody promises to sell you a genuine painting, then they are positively obligated to give you a genuine painting, assuming you hold up your end of the bargain. So it's not that the non-aggression principle doesn't allow for the enforcement of positive obligations. What it says is that positive obligations can't just be imposed onto people, they have to have agreed to them. And this is the problem with a lot of authoritarian arguments on the left. They often like to imply that people do have some kind of positive obligation just just imposed onto them that they've never agreed to, such as to pay for random people's healthcare and education, etc. Now, in the case of child rearing, this is a responsibility that you voluntarily enter into. When you, say, adopt, have sex without a condom, whatever, you voluntarily accept the responsibilities of child rearing. I understand that there are some fringe cases of like rape or contraceptive failure, but an overwhelming majority of cases, parenthood is a voluntarily accepted responsibility. And voluntarily accepting a responsibility and not following through with it does in fact violate the non-aggression principle. So suppose that the neighbors in that area caught wind of this parent neglecting their child or whatever, and since the non-aggression principle does allow for the use of force if it's justifiable, which I'm sure most of us would agree child neglect is a pretty strong argument for forcibly intervening, the neighbors could show up at his house, knock on his door and says, "Hi, we need to come in and take care of your kid. Since you can't seem to be bothered with it, someone has to, and well, we're going to do it." And my mom does social work. She works with kids who are often neglected and abused, so I kind of know from what she tells me that a lot of instances of child neglect aren't really malicious or because of apathy from the parents. A lot of times parents really do want to provide for their children but simply can't afford to. So again, with the example of the painting where there was a potential way of dealing with it that did involve the use of force, in the case of child neglect there may also be a resolution that doesn't involve the use of force, like the community coming together and raising money for the families, helping them out so they can afford to take care of their kids properly. And I really think that's what the non-aggression principle boils down to at the end of the day. Not necessarily that it's always bad to use force, but rather in situations where the use of force may be necessary, are there peaceful alternatives that may also work? And usually the answer is yes. So Mr. Zwolinski basically wraps up his article by saying that non-aggression principle should be done away with, not just amended or altered or revised, but jettisoned altogether. And as I mentioned previously, the problem with that is that believing in the non-aggression principle is kind of what makes someone a libertarian. Once you start arguing for positive rights, or that people's rights should have exceptions for whatever you personally deem to be the greater good, you're kind of no longer a libertarian at that point. You become just another authoritarian. And while he does suggest that libertarians get rid of the non-aggression principle, at no point does he ever suggest anything to replace it with. I mean, you're asking us to take the very core of our ideology and chuck it out the window. I don't think a suggestion as to what to replace it with would be too much to ask. So now let's wrap up this video by just going over some of the key points that were made. In attempting to discredit the non-aggression principle, Mr. Zwolinski portrays it as an overly stringent prohibition on things that initiate force or cause risk, rather than a more reasonable presumption against or responsibility upon people who do these things. In doing this, he's essentially attacking a straw man version of the non-aggression principle that's not practical to implement and thus easier to argue against. Under the non-aggression principle, the use of force may be justified if the person using that force can explain why the situation necessitated it, and they only use the amount of force that's reasonable to deal with the situation. The non-aggression principle prohibits all violations of people's individual rights and self-ownership. In no way is it only limited to physical forms of aggression. Accepting a responsibility and not following through with it is considered a breach of agreement, which does violate the non-aggression principle. Therefore, since child rearing is a responsibility that you voluntarily accept, it would in fact violate the non-aggression principle to neglect your child. And finally, and most importantly, the non-aggression principle is the core belief system of libertarianism. There's no real way you can get rid of it without getting rid of what makes libertarianism unique from other political ideologies. And finally, at no point does Mr. Zwolinski ever give a suggestion as to what to replace the non-aggression principle with, further weakening his case that it should be done away with. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.